At 7 o'clock on July 19, 1945, Commander Eugene B. Fluckey pressed his eye to the periscope of the submarine USS Barb. Through the thin column of glass and steel, he watched a Japanese supply train winding along the rugged coastline of Karafuto, the southern half of Sakhalin Island. The locomotive pulled a long chain of freight cars packed with troops, ammunition, and military supplies. Every crate on that train would eventually be used against American soldiers somewhere in the Pacific. Fluckey knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew he had to stop it. At 31 years old, Fluckey was already one of the most feared submarine commanders in the U.S. Navy. He had completed 5 war patrols as captain of the Barb, sending 17 enemy ships to the bottom of the ocean. His reputation inside the Pacific Fleet was simple. When Fluckey hunted, ships disappeared. For the past 3 weeks, the Barb had been operating in the Sea of Okhotsk, prowling the frigid waters north of Japan. The submarine itself was a Gado-class fleet boat, displacing more than 2,400 tons submerged and carrying a crew of 80 men. She was already one of the most decorated submarines in the Pacific War. For Presidential Unit citations, 8 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation. But the real weapon aboard Barb wasn't the submarine. It was the man commanding her. Just 3 months earlier, Fluckey had received the Medal of Honor for an attack so reckless that many officers initially believed it impossible. In January 1945, he had taken Barb into Namquan Harbor off the coast of China, slipping through minefields and patrol boats into water so shallow the submarine could not dive if discovered. Inside the harbor lay 30 Japanese merchant ships, anchored and protected by what the Japanese believed was an impenetrable defensive position. Fluckey attacked anyway. 6 torpedoes slammed into the convoy. Then 4 more. Explosions tore through the harbor while Barb raced across the surface at high speed, depth charges detonating behind her in violent columns of water. When the attack ended, 8 enemy ships had been destroyed. Barb escaped without a single American casualty. Back in Pearl Harbor, senior officers called it one of the boldest submarine attacks of the entire war. But for Fluckey, the success created a new problem. By mid-1945, the Japanese merchant fleet had been almost completely destroyed. American submarines had hunted so effectively that there were simply fewer targets left at sea. Fluckey had no interest in returning from patrol empty-handed. Before Barb departed for what would become her 12th and final war patrol, he approached the Navy's research and development staff with an unusual request. He wanted rockets. The weapon was experimental. A Mark 51 rocket launcher, designed to fire 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets, each carrying 10 pounds of high explosive. The system was originally being tested as an anti-kamikaze defense for landing ships. Fluckey saw something else entirely. If mounted on a submarine, the launcher could turn Barb into a mobile artillery platform, capable of striking targets along the Japanese coastline. After some persuasion and a considerable amount of Fluckey's stubborn insistence, the Navy agreed. Engineers bolted the launcher to Barb's forward deck. Overnight, the submarine became something the world had never seen before. The first rocket-launching submarine in U.S. naval history. Barb left Midway Island on June 8, 1945, carrying 72 rockets and orders that were refreshingly simple. Cause as much damage along the Japanese coast as possible. 12 days later, the submarine reached the waters north of Hokkaido. At 0230 on June 22, Barb surfaced 3 miles offshore from the coastal town of Sherry. Population, roughly 20,000. Factories there produced supplies for the Japanese military. The submarine turned broadside toward land. Fluckey gave the order. The launcher fired. 12 rockets screamed into the night in less than 5 seconds, streaking across the dark sky before slamming into the industrial district of the town. Explosions tore through warehouses and factory buildings. Fires erupted along the waterfront. Before Japanese forces could respond, Barb submerged and vanished back into the black water of the Sea of Okhotsk. It was the first time in history a submarine had launched rockets against a shore target. Fluckey did not stop there. Over the next 3 weeks, Barb struck repeatedly along the coasts of Hokkaido and Karafuto. More rockets. More bombardments. Factories burned. Shipyards collapsed into wreckage. Japan's largest paper mill was destroyed. A leather factory producing pilot equipment was reduced to ash. Whenever possible, Barb surfaced and joined the attacks with her 4-inch deck gun, firing directly at military installations along the shoreline. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft began hunting for the submarine. Fluckey simply kept moving. Hit one town. Disappear. Strike another coast. Vanish again. By mid-July, Barb had become a phantom haunting Japan's northern waters. Then, on July 19th, while patrolling off southern Karafuto, Fluckey noticed something unusual through the periscope. A railroad line ran along the coastline, less than 400 yards from the beach. Throughout the day, and even during the night, military trains moved along the tracks. Locomotives pulling freight cars packed with troops and supplies. This railroad was feeding Japanese forces preparing to resist a possible American invasion of the home islands. Fluckey watched the trains for 3 days. He studied their schedules. He studied the terrain. The beach was accessible. The tracks were exposed. And slowly, an idea began forming in his mind. Destroying the railroad itself would accomplish very little. The Japanese could repair damaged rails in a matter of hours. What Fluckey wanted was something far more destructive. He wanted to destroy a moving train. Maximum damage. Maximum disruption. Maximum psychological impact. But submarines were not built for attacking land targets. Torpedoes were useless. The rockets were too inaccurate for a moving locomotive. The deck gun couldn't track a train racing through coastal terrain. If he wanted to destroy the railroad, Fluckey would need something different. Something the Japanese would never expect. Something no submarine had ever attempted before. And the solution would begin forming in the most unlikely place aboard USS Barb. Inside a cramped torpedo room, with a pickle jar, a pressure switch, and an idea borrowed from a childhood trick involving walnuts on railroad tracks. The shore party also packed an unusual item among their equipment, raw wooden stakes. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese patrols sometimes used guard dogs along the coastal railroad. If the Americans encountered one of those animals in the darkness, the sharpened stakes might buy them a few precious seconds. Seconds were the only currency that mattered on this mission. But the most important factor wasn't equipment. It was weather. Fluckey needed cloud cover. A 3/4 moon hung over the Sea of Okhotsk. If the sky remained clear, the submarine and the rafts would be illuminated like silhouettes on black water. Japanese sentries on the coastline could spot them from hundreds of yards away. For 4 days, USS Barb cruised slowly along the Karafuto coastline, waiting. The sky cleared, then cleared again. Each night passed without clouds. Fluckey grew increasingly frustrated. Barb's patrol schedule allowed only a limited time in these waters. The submarine would soon have to return to Midway Island. The window for the operation was closing. Then, on the afternoon of July 22nd, the weather finally shifted. Thin cirrus clouds appeared along the horizon. By evening, thicker stratus clouds began covering the mountains along the Karafuto coast. A blanket of cloud was moving in from the west. Fluckey didn't hesitate. Tonight was the night. Preparations accelerated across the submarine. The shore party checked their gear one final time. Waterproof flashlights, sidearms, improvised digging tools, the pickle jar containing the explosive device. Each man wore a Mae West life vest, in case the rafts capsized and they were forced to swim. 2 inflatable rubber rafts were secured on the forward deck, ready for launch. At 2,300 hours, USS Barb began her approach toward the Japanese coastline. Fluckey kept the submarine on the surface, but ordered the crew to run on electric motors instead of the diesel engines. The quieter propulsion reduced the chance of detection. The sky cooperated. Clouds covered the moon. Darkness swallowed the ocean. Through the periscope, Fluckey could see the faint outline of the coastal railroad running parallel to the beach. No lights. No visible patrols. If they were ever going to attempt this mission, this was the moment. Barb crept closer, 950 yards from shore. The depth gauge read 36 feet. It was dangerously shallow. If a Japanese patrol boat appeared, Barb would have less than 90 seconds to perform an emergency dive, and even then the submarine might hit bottom before she fully submerged. Fluckey was gambling everything on surprise and darkness. 8 men assembled on the deck, dressed in dark clothing. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders checked his watch. Midnight approached. Fluckey gave the order. The rafts were lowered into the water. At 00:05 on July 23rd, the men slipped into the Black Sea and began paddling toward the invisible shoreline. Saunders and Lieutenant William Walker took the lead raft with Billy Hatfield and Francis Sever. The second raft carried Lawrence Nuland, Edward Klingelsmith, James Richard, and John Marcus. The paddles dipped silently. No voices, no lights, only the soft sound of water sliding against rubber. Behind them, USS Barb floated motionless in the darkness, a shadow barely distinguishable from the sea. The journey to shore took 25 minutes. The rafts finally scraped against sand at 0030. All 8 men quickly dragged the boats above the tide line and hid them behind rocks and driftwood. 2 men, Nuland and Richard, remained behind to guard the rafts. If Japanese patrols appeared, they would signal the submarine. The other 6 men moved inland. They stepped quietly through tall grass, advancing toward the railroad. In that moment, they became the first American combat troops to set foot on one of Japan's home islands during World War II. Karafuto was fully integrated into the Japanese prefecture system. It was defended territory. If the Americans were captured, they would be considered saboteurs, not soldiers. Execution was the most likely outcome. The ground proved rougher than expected. Tall grass concealed holes and uneven terrain. At one point, Francis Sever nearly twisted his ankle stepping into a hidden depression. The men slowed their pace, feeling each step before committing their weight. 50 yards inland, they encountered a drainage ditch, 3 feet deep with muddy water at the bottom. One by one, they climbed down, waded through, and pulled themselves up the opposite bank. Their clothing was now soaked. Heavy, cold. 100 yards from the beach, they reached a packed dirt road, its surface marked with vehicle tracks. Saunders signaled a halt. The men crouched beside the road, listening. No engines. No voices. Nothing. They crossed quickly, then continued toward the dark ridge of the railroad embankment ahead. At 0050, they reached the base of the tracks. Walker and Saunders climbed carefully onto the rail bed. Steel rails, wooden ties, crushed gravel. The position gave excellent visibility in both directions. Too good. If a Japanese patrol appeared along the tracks, the Americans would be completely exposed. They had to work quickly, but just as they prepared to begin digging, Sever suddenly grabbed Saunders' arm and pointed north. A faint vibration ran through the rails. Moments later, they heard it. A distant mechanical rhythm. A train. The men flattened themselves in the grass beside the embankment. Hatfield pulled the pickle jar tight against his chest. The vibration intensified. The locomotive appeared in the darkness at 0055. No headlight. The Japanese were running trains in complete blackout conditions. The engine thundered past less than 15 feet from the hidden Americans, steam hissing from its valves. The ground shook. Freight cars clattered by. 1, 2, 5, 10, 15. Then the train disappeared southward toward Kashiho. The sound faded into the night. Saunders waited 2 full minutes before signaling the men forward. They climbed onto the embankment and took positions. Klingelsmith moved 50 yards north along the track. Sever moved 50 yards south. Walker positioned himself where he could watch both directions and keep an eye on the road they had crossed. That left Saunders, Hatfield, and Marcus to plant the explosive. Hatfield chose the exact location. A straight section of rail where trains would be traveling at maximum speed. No curves, no hills, nothing to slow the locomotive. Perfect. He knelt between the rails and studied the wooden ties. The explosive needed to be buried directly beneath the rail. The weight of the locomotive would press the track downward just enough to trigger the micro switch. Saunders and Marcus began digging. At first the gravel came away easily. Then they struck compacted soil and rocks. The digging slowed. Each scrape of steel against stone sounded thunderously loud in the darkness. Hatfield checked his watch. They had already been on shore 30 minutes. Time was running out. Then, at 0115, Sever gave a soft whistle. Another train was coming. The men dropped flat again. This one approached from the south, heading north. Hatfield lay beside the half-dug hole, clutching the pickle jar while the digging tools lay scattered across the tracks. If the engineer spotted them, the entire mission would collapse instantly. But again, the locomotive came without headlights. Japanese blackout regulations were unknowingly protecting the American saboteurs. The train roared past at 0117. 14 freight cars rattled overhead. When the sound faded into the distance, Saunders waved the men back to work. They had less than an hour before Barb would be forced to dive. Marcus attacked the hole with renewed urgency. The improvised shovel bit deeper. Saunders broke rocks loose with the pick. Within 15 minutes, they had carved out a cavity beneath the rail, 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep, large enough for the explosive device. Hatfield opened the pickle jar. Inside lay the 55-pound scuttling charge. The cylindrical explosive had originally been designed to destroy Barb itself if the crew ever had to abandon ship. Now it was about to be used against a locomotive traveling at full speed. And if everything worked as planned, the next train to pass over this rail would destroy itself in an instant. Hatfield lowered the 55-pound scuttling charge into the hole beneath the rail and packed dirt tightly around the cylinder so it would not shift when the train passed overhead. Next came the batteries. 3 dry cell batteries were placed beside the explosive and connected carefully with insulated wiring. The final and most delicate component was the microswitch, a tiny pressure trigger that would activate when the rail flexed under the weight of the locomotive. Japanese locomotives typically weighed 60 to 80 tons. That mass, rolling across steel rails, would press the track downward between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. That small movement was all Hatfield needed. But the switch had to be positioned with absolute precision. Too deep, and the rail would never depress enough to close the circuit. Too shallow, and normal vibrations in the track could detonate the charge prematurely. Hatfield worked mostly by feel, not sight. His waterproof flashlight produced only a narrow beam aimed directly into the hole, so its light could not be seen from a distance. He connected the positive battery terminal to one side of the microswitch. The negative terminal ran directly to the detonator embedded inside the scuttling charge. One final wire remained, the connection that would complete the electrical circuit. Hatfield deliberately left it disconnected. Until that wire was attached, the device was safe. At 0135, the wiring was complete. Hatfield glanced at Saunders and nodded. Saunders signaled to Lieutenant Walker. The sentries began withdrawing from their lookout positions. Klingel-Smith returned from the northern end of the track. Sever approached from the south. Walker came up from his position overlooking the road. The 6 men gathered around the excavation. Hatfield made the final connection. The circuit was now live. Any significant pressure on the rail above the switch would complete the electrical circuit and ignite the explosive charge. Carefully, Hatfield covered the device with dirt and gravel, smoothing the surface so the ballast looked undisturbed. To a locomotive engineer racing through the darkness, nothing would appear unusual. The sabotage was invisible. The men slid down from the railroad embankment and began retracing their path back toward the beach. Across the dirt road, through the drainage ditch, back through the tall grass. They moved faster now. The mission was complete. The device was armed. Every additional minute on Japanese soil increased the risk of discovery. At 0145, they reached the beach. Nuland and Richard were waiting beside the rafts. All 8 men pushed the boats back into the surf and climbed aboard. Saunders checked the glowing dial on his watch. They had been ashore for 1 hour and 40 minutes. USS Barb would be preparing to dive. The rafts pushed off. The men began paddling toward the dark shape of the submarine waiting offshore. The distance was 950 yards. In calm water, it should take 15 minutes. They were halfway back when a voice suddenly echoed across the water. Commander Fluckey was shouting through a megaphone from Barb's conning tower. "Paddle faster." Another train was approaching. Fluckey had spotted it through the periscope while tracking the returning rafts. The locomotive itself was invisible, but its exhaust plume rose clearly against the dark mountain skyline. It was coming from the north, heading directly toward the section of track where Hatfield had buried the explosive. The timing was going to be dangerously close. The men dug their paddles into the water. Harder. Faster. The rafts were still 400 yards from the submarine. Fluckey had already maneuvered Barb closer to shore, within 600 yards of the beach, to shorten their return journey. But the move came with risk. The submarine now sat in water so shallow that a crash dive might drive her hull directly into the seabed. Every crewman who wasn't required for submarine operations stood on deck watching the approaching train and the struggling rafts. The distance closed. 300 yards. 200. The sound of the train grew louder. From the rafts, the men could now see the dark outline of the locomotive. It was moving fast, 40 to 45 miles per hour, racing through the straight coastal stretch of track. Less than a mile remained before it reached the explosive. Maybe 90 seconds. Fluckey faced a brutal decision. If he waited for the rafts to reach Barb before diving, the submarine might still be on the surface when the explosion alerted Japanese defenses. Coastal artillery could open fire. Patrol boats could converge. But if he submerged now, the 8 men in the rafts would be stranded in the open ocean. Fluckey chose. He ordered Barb to turn toward deeper water and prepare for an emergency dive. But he would wait. The shore party had earned that. The rafts reached the submarine at 0146. The men scrambled up the slick steel hull and dropped through the open hatch. Saunders was the last man aboard. The rafts were cut loose and abandoned to drift. No time to recover them. All hands below. The hatch slammed shut. Barb's diesel engines roared to life as the submarine accelerated away from the coast. At 0147 on July 23, 1945, the northbound train reached the buried explosive. The locomotive's wheels rolled across the rail. 68 tons of steel pressed downward. The rail flexed. The microswitch closed. The electrical circuit completed. And 55 pounds of high explosive detonated directly beneath the locomotive's boiler. Even from 700 yards offshore, the explosion lit the night. A massive fireball erupted along the railroad embankment. The locomotive disintegrated instantly. The boiler split apart in a violent blast of superheated steam. Drive wheels tore free. Fragments of metal shot 200 feet into the air before crashing back to Earth. Behind the engine, the freight cars had no time to stop. The first slammed into the wreckage at full speed. The second climbed over it. The third rolled off the embankment. Cars 4 through 16 piled into a growing mountain of twisted steel and shattered wood. The sound reached Barb as a deep rolling thunder echoing through the coastal mountains. Fires ignited across the wreckage. Some of the cars carried ammunition. Soon secondary explosions began erupting inside the wreckage. Fluckey ordered the crew topside. Dozens of submariners crowded onto the deck and conning tower, watching the burning wreckage along the Carafuto coast. They had just done something no submarine crew in history had ever accomplished. They had destroyed a Japanese military train using a submarine-launched sabotage operation. It was the only Allied ground combat action conducted on Japanese home island territory during the entire Pacific War. But the celebration was short-lived. Searchlights suddenly swept across the water from the coastline. Japanese military installations had detected the explosion, and they were now searching for the submarine responsible. 3 powerful beams moved across the ocean in coordinated arcs. Barb was still on the surface, running at full speed toward deeper water. If one of those lights caught the submarine, Japanese artillery would open fire within seconds, and the most daring submarine raid of the Pacific War could end in disaster. Commander Eugene Fluckey didn't stay to watch the fires very long. The celebration on the deck of USS Barb lasted only seconds before reality returned. The burning wreckage along the Carafuto coast had already alerted Japanese defenses. Searchlights suddenly pierced the darkness. 3 powerful beams swept across the ocean from different coastal installations, scanning the water for the submarine responsible for the explosion. Fluckey reacted immediately. Come right. Course northeast. Full power. Barb's diesel engines surged to emergency output, running at nearly 150% overload. The same extreme setting Fluckey had used months earlier while escaping Namquan Harbor. The submarine cut through the black water at 23 knots, leaving a glowing phosphorescent wake trailing behind her hull. If one of those searchlights caught that wake, the submarine would be exposed instantly. The depth gauge crept upward. 48 feet. Still dangerously shallow for diving, but deeper than the water they had been operating in near the shore. Behind them, the searchlights continued sweeping the surface in wide arcs. Fluckey held his course. At 0200 hours, the depth gauge finally reached 60 feet. That was enough. Dive. Ballast tanks flooded. Barb's bow dipped forward as the submarine slipped beneath the waves. Within 90 seconds, the boat disappeared completely beneath the surface, leveling off silently at periscope depth. Above them, the searchlights continued probing the water, but the submarine was gone. Invisible. Fluckey ordered the engines switched to quiet electric power to reduce noise. Japanese patrol boats would likely be launching from nearby ports as soon as word of the explosion spread. For the next 6 hours, Barb crept slowly through the dark water, putting distance between herself and the Karafuto coastline, while Japanese forces searched the area above. At 0800 on the morning of July 23rd, Fluckey cautiously raised the periscope. The ocean was empty. The searchlights had vanished with the sunrise. In the distance, smoke still rose from the shattered railroad embankment where the train had exploded. Barb surfaced again and resumed patrol. For Fluckey, the mission wasn't finished. The submarine still had 4 days remaining before she needed to return to Midway Island, and Fluckey intended to use every one of them. Over the next 72 hours, USS Barb continued striking Japanese coastal targets. On July 24th, the submarine surfaced near Sherry and opened fire with her 4-inch deck gun, smashing a military radio station. Direct hits destroyed the antenna towers and set the building ablaze. The following day, Barb attacked a small shipyard at Shirako, destroying 2 wooden coastal freighters that were still under construction. Then, on July 26th, Barb fired her final volley of rockets at a military garrison on Ko Island, sending 12 streaks of fire screaming toward the shore before disappearing back into the open sea. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft hunted relentlessly for the submarine during those final days. Planes crisscrossed the Sea of Okhotsk, scanning for the elusive vessel responsible for the growing destruction along their northern coast. Fluckey avoided them the same way he had avoided enemy warships for years. Constant movement. Silent dives whenever aircraft appeared. Patience. Finally, on July 27th, USS Barb turned southeast and began the long journey back to Midway Island. Her 12th and final war patrol was complete. Barb arrived at Midway on August 2nd, 1945. The crew assembled on deck in dress uniforms. Behind them flew the submarine's battle flag, one of the most unusual in the entire United States Navy. The flag was covered in symbols that told the story of Barb's wartime career. 17 ship silhouettes marked enemy vessels sunk. Insignias represented the submarine's presidential unit citations and other commendations. Rocket symbols and gun emblems showed the shore bombardments along the Japanese coast. Near the top was a ribbon representing Fluckey's Medal of Honor, and at the bottom of the flag, one symbol stood apart from all the others. A Japanese locomotive. The only submarine in history to destroy a train now carried that achievement proudly on its colors. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, personally came to Midway to greet the crew. Photographs were taken for naval archives. 8 sailors stood beside the flag, the same 8 who had gone ashore on Karafuto to plant the explosive beneath the railroad tracks. Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Noland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Marcus, Walker. They looked like ordinary young men. Farm boys, factory workers, mechanics. But they had accomplished something no other Allied unit had done during the entire Pacific War. They had carried out an offensive ground operation on Japanese home island territory and returned safely. The train explosion soon became legendary within the submarine service. Other submarines had fired deck guns at shore targets. Some had launched rockets. But no other submarine had ever landed a sabotage team on enemy soil and successfully extracted them afterward. The mission demonstrated something new. Submarines could do more than hunt ships. They could strike directly at enemy infrastructure. They could deliver special operations teams. They could project power far beyond the ocean. Fluckey received his 4th Navy Cross for Barb's 12th patrol. The citation specifically mentioned the rocket attacks and the destruction of the train. Combined with his Medal of Honor and 3 earlier Navy Crosses, Fluckey became one of the most decorated submarine commanders in American naval history. Yet whenever reporters asked him about the mission, he always gave the same answer. It wasn't about him. It was about his crew. 6 days after Barb returned to Midway, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war ended before USS Barb could begin another patrol. Over 12 wartime missions, first in the Atlantic, then in the Pacific, the submarine had compiled one of the most devastating records in the American fleet. 17 enemy ships sunk, supply lines crippled, coastal installations destroyed. But the moment most people remembered was the night a submarine crew crawled onto Japanese soil and blew up a military train. USS Barb would eventually be retired and sold to another navy, and decades later the submarine was scrapped. But one artifact survived: Barb's battle flag. Today it hangs inside the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut. Visitors can still see it behind glass. The ship's symbols, the rockets, the Medal of Honor ribbon, and at the bottom, the small black image of a locomotive. A reminder of the night when a submarine crew did something no one thought possible. After the war, Eugene B. Fluckey did not fade quietly into civilian life. The Navy still needed him. He first served as an aide to Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, then later worked closely with Admiral Chester Nimitz, the same commander who had personally greeted the crew of USS Barb at Midway. Fluckey's career continued rising steadily. In 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower approved his promotion to Rear Admiral. Over the next decade, he commanded major naval formations and held some of the most important positions in the United States Navy. He led Amphibious Group 4. He served as president of the Naval Board of Inspection and Survey, responsible for evaluating the readiness of the fleet. From 1964 to 1966, he commanded the entire Pacific Submarine Force. By the end of his career, Fluckey was appointed Director of Naval Intelligence, one of the most sensitive and influential roles in the Navy. After 37 years of service, he retired in 1972. But retirement didn't mean slowing down. Fluckey and his wife Marjorie moved to Portugal, where in 1974 they opened an orphanage for children who had lost their families. For 8 years they ran the small home, providing shelter, education, and stability for dozens of children who had nowhere else to go. In 1979, Marjorie passed away. Fluckey remarried in 1980 but continued supporting the orphanage until it closed in 1982. Even after leaving the Navy, he remained deeply connected to the submarine community. In 1992, he published his memoir, Thunder Below, describing the patrols of USS Barb and the extraordinary missions his crew carried out during the war. The book quickly became required reading at the United States Naval Academy, studied by future naval officers as a case study in leadership, innovation, and responsibility. Fluckey passed away on June 28, 2007. He was 93 years old. He was buried with full military honors at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, Maryland. But when Fluckey looked back at his career, there was one number he valued more than all the ships sunk, all the medals earned, or all the recognition received. That number was simple: 0. 0 Purple Hearts awarded to the sailors who served under his command during 5 combat patrols. 0 casualties. That statistic defined Eugene Fluckey's philosophy of command more than any daring raid or tactical innovation. He took risks, but they were calculated risks. He pushed his submarine and his crew to the absolute limits of what they could achieve, but never beyond the point where skill, training, and discipline could compensate for danger. Through 5 war patrols, Barb endured hundreds of depth-charge attacks. She navigated minefields. She operated in shallow coastal waters where a single mistake could have destroyed the boat. Yet every single man who served under Fluckey returned home alive. The sailors of USS Barb eventually scattered back into ordinary life. Paul Saunders returned to civilian work. Billy Hatfield went back to the railroad industry. Others became mechanics, factory workers, farmers, and small business owners. Most of them rarely spoke about the night they paddled ashore on Carafuto. For years, the mission remained classified. Even after it was declassified, the men never chased publicity. They simply believed they had been doing their jobs, trying to win the war, trying to survive, trying to get home. But history did not forget. The 8 men who stepped onto that beach in July 1945 carried out the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home island territory during the entire Pacific War. No Marine divisions landed on Honshu. No American Army fought on Hokkaido. No airborne troops dropped onto Kyushu. Only 8 submariners from USS Barb, armed with shovels, a homemade pressure switch, and a pickle jar filled with batteries, crossed the sand and destroyed a military train deep inside Japanese territory. The mission had effects far beyond the explosion itself. Japanese military planners suddenly realized their coastal railroads were vulnerable. More guards were deployed. More patrols were organized. Engineering teams began inspecting tracks daily. Resources that might have been used to reinforce defensive positions against an American invasion were now diverted to protecting railways. The psychological impact was just as powerful. If American submarines could strike inland targets, then nowhere along the Japanese coast was truly safe. Factories once considered beyond reach could now be attacked from the sea. The 72 rockets Barb fired during that patrol demonstrated a capability that would shape naval warfare for decades to come. The numbers tell part of the story. 17 ships sunk. More than 96,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. A Medal of Honor and 4 Navy Crosses for Eugene Fluckey. 8 battle stars for USS Barb. The first submarine to launch rockets against land targets. The first submarine to deploy a sabotage team on enemy soil. And the only submarine in history to destroy a train. But for Fluckey, the most important number remained the simplest. 0. 0 casualties among the crew during 5 war patrols. He brought every one of his men home. That, more than the tonnage sunk or the medals awarded, was the achievement that mattered most. Today, USS Barb's battle flag hangs inside a museum in Groton, Connecticut. Visitors often pause when they notice the small symbol near the bottom of the flag. A locomotive. At first it seems strange, until they learn the story. The story of 8 sailors who paddled ashore under cover of darkness. A submarine captain who believed in innovation and trusted his crew. And a mission that proved submarines could do far more than hunt ships. They could launch rockets. They could strike enemy infrastructure. They could deliver men silently onto hostile shores. And sometimes, they could blow up a train.